"What's it like?" my daughter-in-law said, her voice smooth and bright in a way that made everyone at the table go quiet. "To spend a lifetime building something no one believes in anymore?" The question hung in the air like a glass about to shatter, and for a moment I thought someone, anyone, might step in, might laugh it off, might say she didn't mean it the way it sounded. But no one did, not even my son, and that was when I realized this dinner had never really been about food, or family, or the pot roast I'd spent all afternoon preparing in a kitchen that used to feel like the center of everything. Because Chloe didn't look embarrassed or uncertain. She looked certain, almost. Curious, as if she were studying me, waiting to see how I would respond. And I could feel every pair of eyes shifting between us, measuring the distance between the old world and whatever new one she believed she was representing. And I remember noticing the smallest details in that moment. The way the overhead light caught the rim of my wine glass, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall that Daniel had insisted on hanging last Christmas. Back when he still called me every Sunday morning just to ask how I was doing. Back when his voice still carried something warm in it, something familiar, but now he sat there with his hands folded too neatly in front of him, staring down at his plate like the pattern in the china was more important than the woman who had raised him. And I understood then that silence can be louder than anything anyone says out loud, because his silence told me everything Chloe's words did not need to, and I could feel something inside me settle, not break, not crumble, just settle in a place the way dust does when the air stops moving. And I didn't rush to answer her. I didn't defend myself or explain the years I'd spent building a business from nothing, the long nights and early mornings, the risks I took when Daniel was still a boy sleeping in the next room. None of that seemed necessary anymore, because this wasn't really a question. It was a performance, and I had just been invited to play a role I no longer recognized. So instead I reached for my fork, steady, deliberate, and cut into the piece of meat on my plate, as if the conversation hadn't shifted at all, as if this were still just a simple family dinner on a quiet Thursday evening in a house I had once filled with laughter. And I could see Chloe's smile tighten just slightly at the corners, the kind of subtle change you might miss if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention now more than I had in years, because moments like this have a way of sharpening your vision, of pulling back the soft filters you didn't even realize you'd been looking through. And I saw her clearly for the first time, not as the charming, confident woman Daniel had brought home 5 years ago, but as someone who understood exactly what she was doing, someone who had chosen this moment, this setting, this audience. And I wondered briefly how long she had been waiting for it, how many small comments and sideways glances had led up to this one carefully delivered line. And I thought about the way she had insisted on hosting more of these dinners lately, the way she had started steering conversations toward topics she knew would create tension, the way she watched people when they spoke, not listening so much as evaluating. And I realized this wasn't new. It had just finally become impossible to ignore, and still I didn't give her what she wanted. I didn't argue or raise my voice or even meet her eyes right away, because I understood something she didn't yet, that not every silence is weakness and not every calm is surrender. And when I finally did look up, I let my gaze move slowly across the table, past the untouched breadbasket, past the half-empty glasses, past my son who still hadn't said a word, until it settled on her. And I offered the smallest smile, the kind that doesn't explain itself, the kind that leaves room for interpretation. And in that moment, I could feel the balance shift ever so slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to know that whatever this dinner was supposed to be, it wasn't going to end the way she expected. And as the clock on the wall ticked forward, marking time the way it always had, steady and indifferent, I realized that this right here wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the moment everything finally became clear. The sound of silverware against porcelain resumed, as if nothing had happened, soft and polite, and almost rehearsed. And for a few seconds a room filled with the kind of small, meaningless noises that people use to avoid saying what they are really thinking. And I let them have that. I let them cling to the illusion that everything was still normal, because it gave me time to watch. And I have learned that people reveal far more in what they avoid than in what they say. And Chloe, for all her confidence, could not quite hide the way her fingers tapped lightly against the side of her glass, a subtle, restless rhythm that betrayed a hint of impatience, as if she had expected a different kind of reaction from me. Something louder, something easier to dismiss. And when it did not come, she shifted her attention to Daniel, tilting her head slightly in his direction with a smile that looked gentle on the surface, but carried something sharper underneath, the kind of look that asked a question without words. And Daniel responded exactly the way I had come to expect over the past 2 years, not by speaking, but by adjusting his posture, by clearing his throat, by reaching for his drink and taking a sip he did not need, small gestures that filled space without adding anything to it. And I wondered, not for the first time, when that had started, when my son had begun replacing his voice with these careful, empty movements, because there was a time when he would have laughed or challenged or at the very least looked at me with something that acknowledged I was still there. But that version of him felt distant now, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Its colors faded into something unrecognizable, and I realized that the dinner itself had been unfolding like this long before tonight, not in grand confrontations, but in a series of small adjustments, small silences, small concessions that slowly reshaped the space until I barely recognized my place within it. And I could trace it back if I wanted to the holidays that became shorter, the phone calls that became less frequent, the invitations that arrived later and later until they felt more like afterthoughts than genuine requests for my presence. And always there was a reason, always something practical, something reasonable on the surface. Schedules were busy, work was demanding, travel was complicated, explanations that made sense individually but formed a pattern when placed side by side. And at the center of that pattern was Chloe, not always speaking, not always directing, but always there, always influencing. The shape of things in ways that were easy to overlook if you were not paying close attention. And I had not been paying close attention. Not at first, because I trusted my son, because I believed that whatever changes came into his life would still leave room for me somewhere within it. And perhaps that was my mistake, not trusting him, but assuming that trust alone was enough to preserve something that needed more than that to survive. And as I sat there at the table, cutting another small piece of food I no longer tasted, I felt the weight of those assumptions settle quietly beside me. Not as regret exactly, but as recognition, the kind that comes too late to change what has already happened, but just in time to understand it clearly. And across from me, Chloe began to speak again, her tone light, conversational, as if the earlier moment had been nothing more than a passing comment. And she shifted the topic to something safer, something neutral, asking about a new development project in the city, about rising property values, about how neighborhoods change over time, and I could hear the underlying thread in her words, the careful framing that positioned me as a relic of an older way of thinking, something outdated, something to be observed rather than engaged with. And it was subtle enough that anyone listening casually might have missed it, but I did not miss it now, not anymore. And I answered her questions simply, without offering more than was necessary, without defending or elaborating, because I understood that explanations would not change her perspective. They would only give her more material to reshape into something that suited her narrative. And as the conversation continued to drift around the table, touching briefly on work, on travel, on things that felt distant and impersonal, I found myself looking at the empty chair at the far end, the one no one had chosen to sit in tonight. And it struck me how easily space can be left unclaimed, how quickly it becomes invisible once people adjust to its absence. And I wondered if that was what had been happening to me all along, not a sudden removal, but a gradual fading, a quiet erasure that no one acknowledged because it was easier not to. And yet, even as that thought settled in, something else began to take shape alongside it, something steadier, something less passive, because understanding a pattern is the first step in breaking it. And for the first time in a long while, I was no longer guessing, no longer hoping that things would correct themselves if I simply waited long enough. I was seeing the structure for what it was. And once you see something clearly, it becomes very difficult to pretend you have not. And as Chloe laughed softly at something one of the others said, her expression relaxed. Now that the moment had passed without resistance, I allowed myself a final glance around the table, taking in each face, each silence, each carefully maintained distance. And I knew, with a certainty that felt almost calm, that whatever came next would not be decided by them alone. The dinner continued in that careful, measured way people use when they're trying to smooth over something that cannot actually be smoothed, and I noticed how easily everyone leaned into it, how quickly they accepted the new rhythm Chloe had set, as if discomfort was something that could be managed simply by ignoring it long enough. And I suppose in many ways it can, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, things do not disappear. They settle, they wait, they gather weight, and I could feel the accumulation of it now. Not just from tonight, but from so many small moments that had come before, moments I had dismissed or explained away because it was easier to believe in good intentions than to question them. And I remembered the first time Chloe had corrected me in front of others. Not harshly, not openly disrespectful, just a gentle interruption, a slight adjustment to something I had said about a neighborhood development, followed by a smile that suggested she was helping, clarifying, improving the conversation, and I had accepted it at the time, even thanked her, because it seemed harmless, because it fit within the boundaries of politeness. But that had been the beginning, and after that came more of those moments, each one just subtle enough to avoid confrontation, each one placing me a little further to the side, a little less central to the conversation, and Daniel had always been there, always present, but increasingly quiet, increasingly willing to let her reshape the dynamic between us. And I could see now how those small shifts had created the space Chloe was standing in tonight, a space where she felt comfortable enough to question me openly, to frame me as something outdated, something to be examined rather than respected. And I wondered if she believed she was revealing something or if she simply enjoyed the control that came with redefining the narrative in front of an audience. Because there was a performance to it, a deliberate pacing in the way she spoke, the pauses, the careful choice of words, the way she glanced around the table as if inviting agreement without ever asking for it directly. And what struck me most was not the boldness of it, but the expectation behind it, the quiet certainty that no one would challenge her, that the structure she had built would hold. And in that certainty, I found something useful, something that told me more than any direct statement could have. Because people only act that way when they believe the outcome is already decided, when they believe the balance has already shifted far enough in their favor that resistance is unlikely. And as I sat there listening to her guide the conversation towards safer ground again, toward topics that allowed her to maintain that sense of control, I realized that for a long time I had been reacting to these moments individually, treating each one as an isolated incident instead of recognizing the pattern they formed together, and that had kept me a step behind, always adjusting, always accommodating, always giving the benefit of the doubt. But clarity changes that. It removes the need to interpret or excuse, and in its place it offers something steadier, something that does not depend on anyone else's behavior. And I could feel that shift happening within me now, not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet alignment, like something that had been slightly out of place, finally settling into its proper position. And I became aware of how different everything looked from that perspective, how the same room, the same people, the same conversation could feel entirely different once you stopped trying to fit yourself into it and instead observed it for what it actually was. And I noticed details I might have missed before. The way Chloe's laughter never quite reached her eyes. The way Daniel's responses were timed to avoid disagreement rather than to express genuine thought. The way others at the table followed her lead without realizing they were doing it, adjusting their tone, their posture, their focus to match hers. And it was not malicious in the obvious sense. No one was raising their voice or making overt declarations. But there was a subtle hierarchy in place, one that had formed gradually and quietly until it felt natural to everyone involved. And that was perhaps the most revealing part of all. Not that it existed, but that it had become invisible, accepted without question. And as I let that understanding settle, I found that I was no longer interested in correcting her or defending myself in that moment. Because the conversation itself was not the real issue. It was simply the surface expression of something deeper, something that required a different kind of response, one that would not be delivered across a dinner table in the middle of a carefully orchestrated evening. And so I allowed the meal to continue. I participated when necessary. I listened more than I spoke, and I let them believe that the earlier moment had passed without consequence, that the balance remained exactly as they perceived it, because there is a certain advantage in being underestimated, in allowing others to think they understand the situation completely when in fact they are only seeing a fraction of it. And as the plates were gradually cleared and the conversation shifted toward plans for the coming weeks, I sat back slightly in my chair, hands resting calmly in my lap, and I understood with a quiet certainty that this dinner had not been the end of anything. It had simply revealed where everything stood, and that knowledge, more than any immediate reaction, would determine what happened next. When the last plate was cleared and the soft clatter of dishes moved into the kitchen, the room seemed to exhale as if it had been holding its breath the entire evening. And I remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, my hands folded neatly in front of me, watching as Chloe stood and began directing the small, quiet cleanup with the same effortless authority she had carried throughout the night. And it struck me how natural it looked to everyone else, how easily they accepted her position at the center of things, as if she had always been there, as if the space had not once belonged to someone else. And I realized then that displacement does not always happen with a clear beginning or a dramatic shift. Sometimes it happens gradually, through a series of moments so small they barely register at the time, and by the time you notice, the structure has already changed around you, and you are no longer standing where you thought you were. And I let that thought settle as I finally rose from my chair, smoothing the front of my blouse in a quiet, habitual motion, the kind I had repeated countless times over the years in situations where composure mattered more than anything else. And as I stepped into the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the darkened window above the sink, the faint outline of my face framed by the soft kitchen light. And for a second, I saw not just who I was now, but who I had been, a younger version of myself standing in a much smaller kitchen years ago with a toddler at my feet and a stack of bills on the counter, calculating how to stretch every dollar just a little further, how to keep everything moving forward even when the path was not clear. And I remembered the long hours, the early mornings before the sun came up, the evenings that stretched well past dinner as I worked through paperwork at the same table where Daniel now sat in silence. And there had been no audience then, no one to witness the decisions, the risks, the sacrifices, only the quiet certainty that what I was building mattered, that it would create something stable, something lasting. And for a long time it did. It created a home where laughter came easily, where conversations were not measured or careful, where Daniel's voice filled the rooms without hesitation. And I held on to that memory for a moment as I watched him. Now, standing near the counter, speaking softly with Chloe, his posture angled toward her in a way that felt both familiar and distant. And I understood that people do not change all at once. They shift, they adapt, they move in the direction that feels most natural to them at the time. And sometimes that direction leads them away from what they once were, not out of malice, but out of a gradual alignment with something new. And perhaps that is what had happened here. Not a sudden break, but a slow realignment that I had been too close to see clearly. And as I reached for a glass to rinse it under the tap, the cool water running steadily over my hands, I felt a calm settle over me that surprised me with its steadiness, because it was not the calm of resignation. It was something else, something more deliberate, the kind that comes from understanding rather than hoping. And I realized that everything I had done in my life, every decision, every calculated risk, every moment of patience had prepared me for something like this, not in the sense that I had expected it, but in the sense that I knew how to navigate uncertainty, how to step back, observe, and act when the time was right. And I set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the others on the counter, the simple act feeling more intentional than it should have. And as I turned to leave the kitchen, Chloe glanced in my direction, her expression composed, polite, the earlier edge softened into something more socially acceptable. And she offered a brief comment about how nice it was that everyone could get together like this, her tone light, almost casual, as if the evening had unfolded exactly as planned. and I met her gaze for a moment, just long enough to acknowledge the statement without agreeing to it. And then I gave a small nod, the kind that ends a conversation without extending it, and continued past her into the hallway, where the house felt quieter, more neutral, removed from the carefully managed atmosphere of the dining room. And as I reached for my coat, I paused for a fraction of a second, my hand resting on the fabric, and I understood with a clarity that left no room for doubt that tonight had not taken anything from me that I had not already begun to lose. It had simply revealed the shape of that loss, defined its edges, made it visible in a way that could no longer be ignored. And with that understanding came something equally important, the realization that what remains after clarity is choice. And as I slipped my coat over my shoulders and stepped toward the door, I knew that whatever came next would not be guided by habit or assumption, but by something far more deliberate, something I had not needed to use in a very long time. And as the door opened and the cool night air met me, sharp and steady, I stepped outside without hesitation, leaving the warmth of the house behind, not as an escape, but as a decision. The night air carried a quiet clarity that I had not felt in a long time, cool against my face as I walked down the short path from their front door to my car, each step measured, unhurried, as if my body already understood something my mind was still arranging into words. And when I reached the driver's side door, I paused with my hand resting lightly on the handle, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because there are moments when life divides itself without announcement, when something shifts so completely that the version of you who arrived is not the same one who leaves. And I could feel that shift now, not dramatic or loud, but steady, grounded, and unmistakable. And as I sat behind the wheel and closed the door, the quiet enclosed space felt different from the silence inside the house. It felt honest, unfiltered, and I allowed myself a long, slow breath before turning the key in the ignition. The engine humming softly as the dashboard lights came to life, familiar and dependable in a way that grounded me. And I did not rush to pull away. Instead, I sat there for a moment longer, looking through the windshield of the house, its windows glowing warmly against the dark, presenting a picture of comfort and belonging that no longer included me in the way it once had. And I realized that what had changed tonight was not the house, not even the people inside it, but my understanding of where I stood in relation to them. And that understanding carried a kind of quiet power because it removed the uncertainty that had kept me waiting, hoping, adjusting, and in its place it offered something far more useful, clarity, and clarity has a way of revealing not only what is, but what can be done about it. And as I finally shifted the car into drive and eased out onto the street, the neighborhood lights passing steadily by, I found my thoughts moving not backward into regret, but forward into consideration, into possibility, and I began to revisit details I had once overlooked, not with emotion, but with precision, the kind of careful review I had learned long ago when decisions mattered, when outcomes depended on understanding every angle before taking action. And I thought about the accounts I had set up years ago, the property still in my name, the documents filed and stored with quiet efficiency, things I had maintained out of habit, out of responsibility, without ever imagining they might one day become relevant in a different way. And yet, now, in the calm aftermath of the evening, they surfaced in my mind with a new clarity, not as burdens, but as resources, as pieces of a structure I had built that still belonged to me, regardless of how others chose to see it. And I considered the conversations I had postponed, the questions I had avoided asking because I believed trust made them unnecessary. And I understood that trust does not eliminate the need for awareness. It simply changes the way you approach it, and perhaps I had approached it too gently, too passively, allowing space to be redefined without ever confirming its boundaries. And as I turned onto the main road, the city stretching out ahead of me, I felt something settle in a place, a quiet resolve that did not need to announce itself, because it was not about confrontation or correction. It was about alignment, about bringing my actions into agreement with what I now knew to be true. And that kind of shift does not require urgency. It requires intention. And I had always been patient when patience was necessary, always willing to wait until the right moment revealed itself. And tonight had done exactly that. It had revealed more than words ever could, more than any direct conversation might have achieved, because it had shown me not just what was said, but how it was received, how it was allowed, how it fit into a pattern that had been forming quietly over time. And once you see a pattern clearly, you no longer need to question whether it exists. You only need to decide what you will do with that knowledge. And as the road opened up in front of me, the steady rhythm of the drive matching the calm rhythm of my thoughts, I realized that the next steps did not need to be dramatic to be effective. They only needed to be deliberate, consistent, and grounded in the same quiet strength that had carried me through every challenge I had faced before. And for the first time in a long while, I was not wondering what would happen next. I was considering how I would shape it. The drive home felt shorter than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because my mind had found a direction, and once direction replaces doubt, time has a way of folding in on itself. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, the quiet house waiting for me did not feel empty the way it once might have. It felt like space, like something open and undisturbed, something I could move through without adjusting myself to anyone else's expectations. And as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the familiar scent of polished wood and old books greeted me with a kind of steady reassurance. And I set my keys down in their usual place, the small, deliberate motion grounding me in a routine that had never needed anyone else's permission to exist. And for a moment, I stood there in the entryway, listening to the silence, not the strained silence of a dinner table filled with unspoken tension, but a natural quiet, the kind that allows thoughts to settle into clear lines, instead of scattered fragments. And I moved slowly through the house, turning on a lamp in the living room, the warm light spreading across the space in a way that felt both familiar and newly significant, because I was seeing it now not as something I had built for others, but as something that remained entirely mine. And that distinction, subtle as it was, changed everything. And I walked over to the desk near the window, the one I had used for years to organize bills, review contracts, and make decisions that carried weight far beyond the room itself. And I opened the top drawer, not with urgency, but with intention, my fingers moving over folders and documents that had been carefully maintained over time, each one a quiet record of choices made, risks taken, and responsibilities managed. And I began to pull them out one by one, not because I did not already know what was there, but because there's a difference between knowing something exists and actively engaging with it. And as I spread the papers across the desk, I felt that same calm focus I used to rely on when a decision mattered, when outcomes depended on clarity rather than assumption. And I reviewed everything with that same steady attention, the accounts still under my name, the property titles, the agreements that had been structured with foresight rather than convenience. Things I had once considered simply part of maintaining order now revealed themselves as something more, something that provided. Options, and options, I have learned, are a form of power that does not need to announce itself to be effective. And I thought about Daniel then, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of distance that allowed me to see him more clearly than I had in years. And I realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing these things as part of me and had begun to view them as separate, as something that could be reinterpreted, redirected, or even claimed through proximity rather than understanding. And perhaps Chloe had reinforced that perception, shaping it carefully over time until it felt natural to both of them. And I could see now how easily that belief could grow if it was never challenged, if it was allowed to exist without resistance. And I understood that correction does not always come through words. Sometimes it comes through structure, through decisions that redefine the boundaries in ways that cannot be misinterpreted. And as I organized the documents into neat, deliberate stacks, I felt the shape of what needed to be done becoming clearer, not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a continuation of something I had always done, protecting what I built, ensuring that it remained aligned with my intentions rather than someone else's assumptions. And I moved through the process without haste, making notes where necessary, setting aside what required follow-up, the rhythm of it familiar, almost comforting in its precision. And as the clock on the wall marked the passing of time with its steady, quiet ticks, I realized that nothing about this required confrontation. Nothing required raised voices or dramatic declarations. Because the most effective changes often happen quietly, beneath the surface, until they're fully formed and impossible to ignore. And when I finally leaned back in my chair, looking at the organized space in front of me, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the evening I had just left behind and everything to do with what I had set in motion now. And I understood that whatever Chloe believed she had established at that dinner table existed only within the limits of her perspective. And perspectives can change very quickly when they are met with reality. And as I turned off the lamp and allowed the room to settle back into darkness, I knew with a certainty that did not need confirmation that the next time we sat at a table together, the balance would not look the same, not because I would demand it, but because I would have already ensured it. The next morning arrived without urgency, the pale light filtering through the curtains in a way that felt steady and unintrusive, and I woke not with the heaviness that used to follow difficult evenings, but with a quiet clarity that had settled sometime during the night. The kind that does not demand attention, but remains present in everything you do, and I moved through my routine with the same deliberate pace I had always preferred, making coffee, opening the windows slightly to let in the cool air, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood beginning its day. And there was something grounding in those small, familiar actions, something that reminded me that stability does not disappear simply because someone else chooses to question it. And as I sat at the kitchen table with my cup in hand, I allowed myself to revisit the evening, not to relive it, but to examine it with the same measured perspective I had applied to everything else. And what stood out now was not the words themselves, but the structure around them, the way the conversation had been guided, the way reactions had been anticipated and managed. And I could see clearly that what had taken place was not spontaneous. It had been shaped, positioned, and delivered with intention, and that understanding removed any lingering uncertainty because intention leaves patterns, and patterns can be traced. And as I finished my coffee, I set the cup down carefully and reached for my phone, scrolling through messages and emails with a calm focus, noting small details I might have overlooked before: timing, tone, frequency, the subtle shifts that revealed more than the words themselves. And I saw now how invitations had become more conditional, how information had been shared selectively, how decisions had been presented as already made rather than discussed, and none of it had seemed significant on its own, but together it formed a clear outline, one that pointed not just to behavior, but to strategy. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, considering it without emotion, because emotion would only blur the edges, and what I needed now was precision. And I thought about the upcoming weeks, the plans that had been mentioned casually at the dinner table, gatherings, discussions, decisions that would likely follow the same pattern if left uninterrupted. And I understood that waiting for those moments to unfold without preparation would simply place me back into the same position I had just stepped out of, and that was no longer an option. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because clarity, once achieved, requires alignment and action. And I stood, moving to the desk in the living room where the documents from the night before remained neatly arranged, and I reviewed my notes again, adding to them where necessary, not in haste, but with the same careful consideration that had guided every significant decision I had made in my life. And I identified what needed to be addressed, what could remain as it was, and what required adjustment. And there was a quiet satisfaction in that process, not because it was easy, but because it was clear, and clarity removes the weight of hesitation. And as I worked, the hours passed without interruption, the steady rhythm of thought and action creating a sense of momentum that did not rely on urgency. And at one point I paused, looking out the window at the street beyond, the movement of cars, the passing of people, all of it continuing as it always had, unaffected by the small but significant shift that had taken place within me. And I realized that this was how change often works, not as a sudden, visible event, but as a quiet realignment that gradually alters everything that follows. And I returned to my work with that understanding, making a few calls, sending a message or two, each action simple on its own, but part of a larger structure that was taking shape. and I did not need to announce it or explain it because its effectiveness. If something unspoken had settled into the space, and everyone could feel it without quite naming it, and Chloe greeted me at the door with a composed smile, her tone pleasant, measured, the sharpness from before carefully concealed beneath a layer of practiced civility, and I returned the greeting with the same level of politeness, matching her tone without extending it, and as we moved into the dining room, I noticed the small adjustments. The table set more simply, the seating arrangement, more deliberate, Daniel positioned between us as if proximity could serve as balance, and I took my seat without comment, allowing the evening to unfold at its own pace, because I had no interest in forcing anything. And the conversation began with familiar topics, safe and neutral, the kind that fills space without testing it, and I participated just enough to maintain the rhythm, offering responses that were clear but contained, neither inviting nor resisting, and I could sense Chloe watching, not openly, but with the same careful attention she had shown before, as if she were trying to read a pattern that no longer presented itself in the way she expected, and that subtle shift seemed to unsettle her more than any direct challenge might have, because unpredictability disrupts control, and control had always been her advantage. And as the meal progressed, Daniel made a few attempts to steer the conversation towards something more personal, asking about my week, about my plans, his voice carrying a tentative quality that suggested he was searching for a familiar ground that no longer existed in the same way, and I answered him calmly, but without offering the kind of openness that would allow the old dynamic to reestablish itself. And I could see the effect of that restraint, not dramatic, but noticeable in the way the conversation paused slightly longer between exchanges, in the way Chloe adjusted her posture, her smile tightening just enough to reveal the effort behind it, and then, as if unable to resist testing the boundary, she returned to a familiar line of discussion, bringing up recent changes in the market, the evolution of business practices, her tone light but edged with implication. And this time, instead of deflecting or simplifying my response, I allowed a brief silence to settle before speaking, not as a hesitation, but as a choice, and when I did speak, my words were measured, precise, grounded not in opinion, but in fact in structure, in realities that did not depend on interpretation, and I watched as the effect of that shifted the room in a way that no raised voice ever could, because it did not invite argument. It simply redefined the space in which the conversation was taking place. And for a moment, Chloe said nothing, her expression composed, but still, as if recalibrating, and Daniel glanced between us, uncertain, caught in a balance that no longer aligned as easily as it once had. And I did not press further. I did not extend the moment beyond what was necessary, because the point had already been made, not through confrontation, but through presence, through the quiet assertion of something that could not be dismissed or reshaped. And as the evening continued, the tone remained careful, the conversation more restrained, and I allowed it to remain that way, because this was not about winning a moment, it was about establishing a new understanding, one that would carry beyond a single dinner. And when the meal came to an end, I stood, thanked them for the evening with the same calm politeness I had maintained throughout, and as I reached for my coat, I could feel the shift fully settled now, not just within me, but within the space itself. And as I stepped toward the door, Chloe met my gaze for a brief second, her expression unreadable, but no longer certain. And that was enough, because certainty, once broken, rarely returns in the same form. And as I walked out into the night once again, the air cool and steady around me, I understood that the balance had already begun to change, not because I had demanded it, but because I had quietly ensured it. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened on the surface, no confrontations, no raised voices, no sudden declarations that would signal a clear resolution, and yet everything felt different in a way that could not be undone, because once a structure has been seen clearly, it cannot return to what it was before it was understood, and I moved through those days with the same steady rhythm I had established, not waiting for something to change, but allowing the changes already set in motion to take their natural course, and it did not take long. for the effects to begin revealing themselves in small, unmistakable ways. Daniel's messages became more careful, more direct, no longer assuming but asking, no longer presenting decisions as conclusions, but as considerations, and there was a noticeable shift in tone, not dramatic, but real, the kind that comes when someone begins to recognize that the ground beneath them is not as fixed as they once believed, and Chloe, for her part, became more measured, her words chosen with greater precision, her presence less dominating, as if she were adjusting to a space that no longer responded to her in the same predictable way. And I observed all of it without interference, without the need to comment or correct, because the adjustment itself was the response. And as I sat one afternoon in the same chair by the window, reviewing a set of finalized documents that had now been quietly updated and secured, I felt a sense of completion that did not depend on their awareness or approval. Because what had needed to be done had already been done. The boundaries had been reestablished, not through argument, but through structure, through decisions that would stand regardless of how they were perceived. And I thought back to that first evening, to the carefully delivered question, to the expectation behind it, the certainty that had shaped the moment, and I realized how much of that certainty had relied on assumptions that no longer held, assumptions about access, about influence, about what could be said without consequence. And those assumptions had not been challenged directly. They had simply been rendered inaccurate. And there's a quiet finality in that kind of change because it does not invite debate, it does not require agreement, it simply exists. And as I placed the documents back into their folder and closed the drawer, the soft click echoing gently in the room, I understood that the real shift had never been about a single conversation or a single evening. It had been about clarity, about seeing something for what it was and choosing not to look away, and that choice had altered everything that followed, not by force, but by alignment. And when Daniel called later that evening, his voice carrying a hesitation that had not been there before, asking if we could meet, just the two of us, I agreed without question because I no longer approached these moments with expectation, only with awareness. And when we met, his words came more slowly, more carefully, as if he were navigating a space that no longer responded the way he remembered. And I listened, not to correct him, not to guide him, but simply to hear what he chose to say when the familiar structure was no longer in place. And there was something honest in that, something unpolished and uncertain that had been absent for a long time. And I responded in the same measured way I had come to rely on, clear, calm, and without the need to fill the space with anything unnecessary. And when the conversation ended, there was no dramatic resolution, no clear declaration of change, but there was a difference, a subtle but undeniable shift in understanding. And as I walked back to my car, the late afternoon light stretching across the pavement, I felt no need to define it further, because not everything requires a final statement to be complete. Some things simply settle into place quietly, firmly, and remain there. And as I drove home, the familiar roads unfolding in front of me, I realized that what I had regained was not something they had taken, but something I had allowed to become unclear. And now that it was clear again, it did not require validation. It did not depend on recognition. It simply existed, steady and self-contained. And as I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, the silence that followed felt complete, not empty, not waiting, just complete. And I sat there for a moment, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and understood with a calm certainty that there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reclaim, because everything that mattered had never truly been lost. It had only needed to be seen again, and now that it was, everything else would follow its own course, without my interference, without my permission, exactly as it should.